Okay, this is the lecture notes for section 1 of chapter 5. This is a retake. The first one, the sound did not record correctly. This is Beginning of American Identity, 1689-1763, the essential question. What traditions, events, and forces helped form an American identity? Why it matters now. The religious and political values of the 18th century remain powerful forces in many aspects of modern American life. Begins of American identity. Despite their ethnic and religious diversity, the American colony shared important traditions and values, such as respect for religious liberty, freedom of conscience, and representative government. Events such as the French and Indian War united the colonists, while cultural movements such as the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening encouraged the development of a distinct American identity. Section 1, Early American Culture. Before you learn, colonial settlers came from different backgrounds and established varied and prosperous economies. Now you will learn the British colonies developed a unique culture shaped by prosperity, literacy, and new movements in religion and thought. Terms and names. Great Awakening. Christian religious movement. Enlightenment. Philosophical movement stressing human reason. I will explain further about the Great Awakening and Enlightenment in a minute. Jonathan Edwards, preacher who delivered fiery sermons during the Great Awakening. George Whitefield, preacher who drew large crowds during the Great Awakening. Benjamin Franklin, American writer, publisher, scientist, inventor, and diplomat. He was also an Enlightenment thinker. John Locke, English philosopher who argued that people have natural rights. Those natural rights are life, liberty, and property. These are the same ideas that you're going to find in the Declaration of Independence. And Thomas Jefferson, when writing the Declaration, did use John Locke's ideas. John Locke was an Enlightenment thinker. So, a new kind of society. How did the American colonies differ from older societies? Well, let's look at the chart like we did in the book. First, the British system had 3 tiers. Very few people were in the elite. These were the rich landowners. Remember, land was not very much available. Only about 5% of the people owned land. It didn't come up for sale very long, often. In America, you have a much larger elite class. These are your large plantation owners, your large merchant class in New England and the middle colonies. In Britain, you have about, probably less than a fourth, probably closer to a fifth of the people would be in the middle class. Lawyers, merchants, doctors, clergy, tradespeople, craftspeople. In America, there's a much larger percentage of the population is in this middle class, made up of pretty much the same people, but we also have free workers and poorer farmers because so many more people own land, they could be considered the middle class. They also had voting rights because they owned land. In Britain, most of the population, over half of the population, was servants, laborers, and the poor. In America, a very small percentage of the people made up the poor class or the white servants. One thing that the Americans had that the Britons didn't have was slaves. And of course, these were mainly concentrated in the South, but could be found in all regions of America. Settlers are going to adapt to the new climate and living conditions. There's going to be cheap farmland, abundant resources let the poor rise into the middle class, and sometimes even into the elite classes. Land ownership is going to have the ability to pay fees in a city to give you voting rights. So voting rights are for the people who own lands, and if you have enough money in the city, you can also vote for or pay for that right to vote also. There's also a higher literacy rate in America than what there was in Britain. The highest literacy rate was in New England and the middle colonies. There was more diversity and religious tolerance, and there was no class of nobility. So, colonial life. What was life like in the colonies? Well, most people lived or worked on farms, and the tasks were divided between men and women. As I told you in class, this was the separate spheres. Women's work was mainly at home. Men's work was in the world. So men's work was things that took them out of the house. If they were craftsmen, they did their work outside the home. If they were farmers, they were in the fields or they were out on the ships or something away from home. They also were participating in government. Women, on the other hand, their sphere was the home. They had to make sure that the home ran properly, that the children were fed and educated, the house was taken care of, that people had clothing. So that was the women's sphere. Children, for the most part, they learned at home. Men or boys could go to school. There was no free education, as your book stated erroneously, but there were schools, and generally the teacher at those schools were men. It was very rare to have a female as a teacher. Women did teach their children how to read in the home setting, and that was basically the only reason why women were taught to read and write, is so that they could teach their children, especially their male children, how to read and write. So there was a very high literacy rate, and the reason was is because, of course, they believed that the Bible was an important element of their life, and so they wanted people to be able to read the Bible. The diverse population encouraged ethnic and religious tolerance throughout the colonies. How did the Great Awakening change American society? The Great Awakening is going to be important because it's a religious movement of the 1730s and the 1740s that was led by some traveling ministers. They taught that inner religious feelings were more important than outward behavior. They had the evangelical idea of a spiritual rebirth that was introduced and became part of the American culture. Some of the churches that had been previously established before the Great Awakening were greatly weakened by the Great Awakening because people began to join other religious groups. They started challenging the authority of the church, and other religious groups were able to be established. The idea of spiritual equality led some churches to welcome African Americans and even Native Americans. Some even allowed slaves to preach and women to speak in church. There was a problem with this new Great Awakening, especially in the South. It was really going to be challenging the social system of the South and the idea that masters were over slaves and that they were inferior. And so, with the spiritual equality, people start seeing not just spiritual equality, but overall equality. So, the Great Awakening is going to start stirring people's ideas of how they can challenge the church and challenge eventually even the government. The Enlightenment. How did the Enlightenment influence the colonists? It stressed the use of reason and science to improve society. It called for justice, equality, social and political change, and it encouraged a belief in progress. Uh, Benjamin Franklin, probably the most important of the Enlightenment thinkers in America. He became very wealthy. He was a publisher, he was an inventor, and at the age of 42, he decided to retire. And he used his ideas that Enlightenment thinking could improve society. So he started some of the very first public libraries, the very first fire departments. He invented things that would improve society. He did experiments. He found out that lightning was electricity. And so he made lightning rods on people's homes so that their houses wouldn't burn down. The electric charge would be taken into the ground instead of into the home. So he did things in order to improve society based on science and reason. It also encouraged the belief in progress. Probably the most important Enlightenment thinker was an English philosopher named John Locke. John Locke believed that government was made by people for people, and because of this, if the people didn't like it, they could change it and get rid of that government. He also didn't believe that kings were divinely appointed. Kings were stating that God made them king, and because of that, that you had to follow the king or you were going against God's wishes. He challenged that belief. And his most important thing was known as natural rights. He believed that all people had the rights to their life, their liberty, and their property. Again, these were the same principles used in the Declaration of Independence. And I think that is it. It is. All right. Thank you for listening.